Yeah, hi, John Flanders here. I'm talking to Geoff Mirelowitz out in Seattle about his experience with the Seattle hotspot with the coronavirus. And maybe Jeff is a retired railroad worker like myself, with almost 20 years of experience, as I understand it. He could comment about that as well, but whatever. Jeff, so what's your experience been out there in the Seattle area with this coronavirus?
I think all of us found that our consciousness about what has been going on lagged behind reality. So in our own experience, we made a trip to Southern California the first weekend in March. If that trip had been scheduled a few weeks earlier to see my sister, if it had been scheduled for 1 week later, I'm certain we would not have gone. The flight down there was packed. The flight home 3 days later was the emptiest plane I've been on in years and years. So it took a while to catch up with what was really taking place here. And at that time, we were what's the word for it? The center of the virus problem in the United States, with the largest number of cases, the largest number of deaths, and so on. That's no longer true by a long shot, because it's gotten so much worse in other cities. But in any event, I think it took us a while to really understand the extent of the problem. And then when we got home, Lisa, who works at the Boeing company, just went back to work because that's, what everybody was still doing at that point. And even when the governor here, who's a liberal Democrat and who has gotten, some decent reviews for the way he's handled the crisis here, he did not issue a serious stay-at-home order for the state until the Boeing company finally decided to close its plants here for 2 weeks. And the impetus for the Boeing company closing its plants was the first death of a Boeing worker the night before they made that announcement. Lisa said prior to that, there was lots of discussion in the factory that she works in Renton among workers about how safe it was to continue coming to work. And in some cases, workers who have to be in very close quarters said they didn't feel comfortable doing that and were generally told by the bosses, fine, if you don't feel comfortable, you can go home. But that meant going home with no pay, which of course is harder for people to do. So after a week or more of that, they finally did decide to close both the factories, and they remain closed now, although Boeing announced over the weekend that it would begin production again of a military plane in each of the two factories here and would call back a limited number of people to work on those planes. Now, the stay-at-home order, which was finally issued by the governor, is in effect until May 4th for everything other than what is termed an essential business. And no one has yet to explain what makes producing a single airplane at this point essential.
Well, that's interesting because I remember reading, this is history, but the Pennsylvania Railroad back in the 19th century, they used to say that the Pennsylvania legislature would meet until Tom Scott, the president of the railroad, would tell them to go home. And it sounds to me like your liberal Democratic governor, who made a big name for himself during the camp, didn't he run for president?
Yeah, Jay Inslee. He was the candidate who ran on the basis of climate change.
So he basically followed the dictates of the Boeing company. Then it sounds to me.
I think all the objective evidence indicates that, although there's no discussion about that in the press. So for instance, I watched a live press conference that he held, and this was before Boeing announced closing the plants, but far enough into the crisis that the press conference itself was virtual. That is, there were no reporters in the room, and everything was done with people, calling in.
Yeah.
And yet, and at the time, I remember clearly one of the reporters saying to him, well, are you going to actually issue an order for people to stay home and to close non-essential businesses? And Inslee said, oh, that's not really necessary yet. It's enough for me to just tell people that I strongly encourage them to do that. That's what we need to do, blah, blah, blah. Meanwhile, not a single reporter asked about the Boeing company. And one thing you have to remember is that despite the growth of the technology industry in Washington State and in Seattle especially, the Boeing company remains the largest employer in the state. 72,000 people work for the Boeing company in the state of Washington, and that does not include thousands of other people who work for suppliers that are totally dependent on whether Boeing is open or not open. So it was kind of stunning to me that not a single reporter said to Inslee, well, what about those two giant Boeing factories that have thousands of workers in close contact with one another every day? What do you think about that? No one even asked.
Yeah. Has Inslee been doing what Cuomo's been doing, having a daily press conference? Cuomo's getting all kinds of publicity here for doing that.
Yeah, I know that. I read the New York Times every day, and I noticed the main publicity Cuomo's getting today is that he and de Blasio are in a pissing match about who has the right to decide whether the schools reopen or not,
yeah.
Which doesn't, frankly, from my 3,000 mile away vantage point, doesn't make Cuomo look quite as presidential as he might have looked last week. But I honestly, I don't know if Inslee has a daily news conference. I don't think he does. I read a daily announcement from the health department in King County, which is the county that Seattle is in, that goes over all of the recent figures and reports whatever news people need to know about the outbreak. I don't believe Inslee's doing a daily press conference.
Okay. Well, how has it affected you and your wife's or companion's daily life? I mean, she's off work now. I mean, I take it, and she has planned to go back to work under these circumstances?
Well, that's a complicated question. Boeing claims that it will only bring people back to work in a way that protects their safety. But the company that was responsible for the recent MAX disaster and the deaths of almost 400 people really can't be trusted when it comes to protecting safety. And it's utterly unclear what measures Boeing intends to take or how they will cope with the fact that airplanes can't be built with every worker 6 feet apart from every other worker. It's not that kind of industry. Fortunately for Lisa, it's not posed yet. She has not received a callback. So technically, like thousands of others, she's furloughed for now. If she's called back to work, we'll have to make a judgment about how safe we think it is for her to go back. We're fortunate in a way that many other workers are not. We're older, we don't have children, we live in a house that is paid off, and if we decided that Lisa really couldn't go back to work safely, that's a decision that we could manage. And she turned 58 while the Boeing shutdown has been going on, and that means that she's now able to take her Boeing pension without a penalty. So that's another option for us, but we just haven't decided yet.
Yeah, I mean, those are all I mean, I feel like we're kind of in the same situation here. My wife and I are both retired with pensions, although who knows how much longer pensions will pay, under the current circumstances. We're really in uncharted territory now. But I mean, at her age, it would still be something of a question, right? I mean, bailing on on a full pension and so on and so forth.
Yeah, the biggest issue for us would be that she's still 9 years away from Social Security age.
Yeah.
When she turns 62, she's entitled to spousal railroad retirement benefits, which won't be as good as, for instance, they are in your situation, because I was fired from the railroad after about 17 and a half years. So my railroad retirement benefits are not as good as somebody who lasted for 30 years or more, and Lisa's benefits are determined by mine. So that's a factor. But we have in our plans, before all of what we're dealing with now happened, we were planning for her to retire early. And we think again, because our house is paid off and we do have two sources of income, we think with what we've managed to put away over our lifetime and those two sources of income that we could probably manage. I was fired at the age of 58, so I feel a certain responsibility to let Lisa retire at that age also, since that's when I did it.
Yeah. I mean, these are all difficult life decisions to make, of course, and I mean, as I said, we're in uncharted waters in terms of the capitalist system, such as it is in the United States. What about her co-workers? Has she got any sense of how they're coping with everything?
I think it varies a lot. Depends on an individual's circumstance. I think everyone has serious safety concerns. One way that you or anybody who's on Facebook can sort of make your own, get some information of your own. There's a Facebook page called Rosie's Machinists 751.
Yeah, I remember that. Yeah.
And it's a good source of both information, and I find it interesting to read the discussion among workers there over what is going on. I think that the safety concerns became paramount at a certain point. On the other hand, for younger workers who both feel, rightly or wrongly, less vulnerable to the disease and also feel more vulnerable economically, I think there was and is a feeling that we can't stay out indefinitely. When Boeing first closed the plants here, they agreed to keep paying people. And that was their stance for the first 2 weeks. So of course the decision was popular among almost all workers. And the hesitancy to walk out or refuse to come to work before Boeing made that decision was in large part because workers hoped that the company would agree to keep paying, that it would feel the pressure to do that. When they extended the shutdown, they ended that policy. But unemployment benefits in the state of Washington are very high. They're the third highest in the country. So a Boeing worker who meets this qualification of having worked a certain number of hours in the past year, and I think it's 660 hours, something like that. So any worker who was employed for the full year meets that. The unemployment benefit for the week is $790. And with the federal government program that was passed by Congress, that's supposed to, an additional $600 a week is supposed to be added to that. So I think there are a lot of workers who would really rather just stay home now until they're confident that the workplace they're going back to would actually be safe.
Yeah, right. Well, I mean, what about other workers that are not working for Boeing? How, I mean, I would imagine that the Boeing workers are considered a little bit privileged. I mean, in general population, as opposed to the grocery workers and people like that.
Absolutely. Boeing workers are not as advantaged as they once were relative to other workers. A lot of people don't fully understand what has happened to the Boeing wage scale over the last 30 years, and in particular, what has happened to the pension plan, which with a fixed pension plan, no longer exists for any worker hired after 2016. And even for workers who are still covered by it, like Lisa is, her benefit was frozen in 2016, and any hours that she worked after 2016 no longer are figured towards the pension plan. So it's quite a change. On the other hand, yes, there's no doubt that the wages for lots of other workers and the benefits, even with the attack on the pension plan, are much more limited for other workers. There was just a big article in the Seattle Times yesterday that you can look at on my Facebook page about the situation facing agricultural workers in Eastern Washington. Well, a lot of people don't realize this, but Washington is an enormous agricultural state.
Actually, we do realize that, and because our big grocery chain here, Price Chopper, has a train that comes in from Washington, I think every week, with all kinds of agricultural goods.
That makes complete sense to me. Anyway, the conditions of agricultural workers that are spelled out in this article, they're criminal. The article says that in response to the virus, the state legislature and the governor are setting new rules for the working conditions of farm workers, but none of them are in effect yet. According to the article, they'll go into effect soon, whatever that means. Meanwhile, lots of farm workers don't have access to hot water, to soap. The whole thing is frankly scandalous when you read the article and see the conditions in which people are compelled to work. And that really brings us to an even broader issue, because what is facing farm workers in Washington is true also in California and any place else where farm workers are engaged in agriculture. But if you followed what's happening in meat and poultry plants across the United States, it's a total catastrophe for workers there. And some plants are being closed, which is a good thing because there's no way to guarantee worker safety there. And deaths have already begun because of the criminal conditions that workers have had to labor in. And the issue then becomes what's going to happen to the food supply.
Yeah. Well, are the demographics of the farm workers in Washington similar to those in California? I mean, Mexicans and
yes,
Central Americans and so on?
Yes. And as in California, it includes both families that have lived here for generations that originally came primarily from Mexico, as well as people who regularly come back to Washington each year to work some of the harvests.
And does the ICE play the same kind of role that they play around here, trying to deport people who don't have proper paperwork and so on?
I think
Washington?
I think their policies are the same everywhere. I confess I don't know a lot about what has been happening recently. My sense of both the local papers and the national media is that some of those efforts have slowed down for now. Mm-hmm. My guess is that the government is less concerned right now about deporting people and more concerned about whether there are going to be enough workers to keep the food supply going.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Geoff, thanks a lot. This has been very informative, and I hope you and Lisa survive okay out there. We all are in the same boat, I guess, at our age. So we'll wind this up now, and thank you very much for talking to us.
Thank you, John, and I wish the same for you and yours. Let's stay in touch.
We will. Thank you.